We're moving right along in 2 Corinthians. We're up to chapter 3, lesson 3, chapter 3. A nice 13-chapter book, which works wonderfully for a quarterly study because there are 13 Sundays usually, or 13 weeks in that quarter. So lesson 3, chapter 3. We're looking at the new covenant is the title or the theme, if you want to call it that, for this lesson and this letter to the Corinthians. The Hebrews writer said in Hebrews chapter 1, the opening of his letter or book, whatever you want to call it, he said, "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world." A powerful couple of verses, because not only does it show that Jesus is authoritative, the special, in fact, the whole book of Hebrews, that is in a the most direct way the point of the whole book. Jesus is better. Jesus' covenant is better. His priesthood is better. Everything about Jesus and the new covenant is better. So it shows that he has an authoritative role, and it also shows that the way that God has spoken with humanity has changed over time. No matter how we might look at these verses and try to determine exactly what the writer is saying, it's almost impossible to miss the main point, maybe not the main point, but the fact that he says, it used to be different than it is now. God used to speak to our fathers by the prophets. In fact, I guess in a way you could go even before that and say that God spoke to our fathers. The heads of the fathers, the heads of the houses, which we see in places like Job and with Abraham and Noah and Adam and Eve, for that matter, Adam. So God formerly dealt with humanity either by speaking directly to them or through various prophets. He would send prophets. But now the Hebrews writer is is saying his plan has changed. It's different now. It's changed. He now speaks to us. His plan is communicated and based on the teachings of his Son, he says, which we know, Jesus Christ. Similar to what Jesus himself said in Matthew 28, right before he ascended into heaven, he said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and disciple all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." So again, the authority, adding on to, I guess the Hebrews writer added on to that. Well, after Jesus' crucifixion, what we understand, based on the teachings of the New Testament, is that the law of Moses ceased to be in force. Why do we believe that? We believe that because Paul said that in so many different ways. Colossians 2:14, Paul talked about how Jesus' death resulted in the canceling, to use his words, canceling the record of death that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. In Acts 13:39, this was necessary because the old law couldn't bring about justification. It was impossible. The Hebrews writer deals with that as well. But Jesus can. And therefore, as he said in Hebrews 8:6, he has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So, even though the covenant has changed from one to another, doesn't mean that the law of Moses was a failure. There are negative connotations to the word failure that would imply that it was not able to accomplish what it was meant to accomplish. Is that a fair definition of failure? It was not able, in the end, to accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish. That's the key. That is not the case with the law of Moses. It is true that there are some things that it was not able to accomplish, but the things that it was not able to accomplish it was never meant to accomplish. Dean, do you have something? Mm-hmm.
So the law, in its time, it was perfect in a way. So we know that God never did intend it for the law of Moses to be last forever.
Yeah.
And we know that he already, in the beginning of time, he told us he's going to send his son. So, and the law of Moses is basically a way that God carried out his promise of his word that he was going to send the Messiah. It was through the lineage of the children of Israel, the law of Moses was given to them.
Yeah.
So that was just one way that he was using to carry out his will. And we know that even from the beginning of time, it says there in Hebrews that God has always communicated with man. He has never left man alone on his own. He has always provided a way to show man or tell man what he wanted him to do. And God created man, so God did not leave man on his own.
Mm-hmm.
He's always been there, and he always will be.
Yep. Even if God went many years without speaking to man, he had still spoken. And so his people through the ages still had his word to fall back on. So it's not a matter of, we read of at least two periods of around 400 to 450 years where God, as far as the text is concerned and what it seems to indicate, that God was silent. But he had still spoken already. And so it was not that God had left them alone, because they already had his word. And in that way, it's not almost, it's exactly as today. He has spoken. So it shouldn't be a concern to anybody that God is no longer speaking to the heads of the houses or sending prophets who are directly inspired by his Spirit or anything of the sort, because we have his word. Now, the law of Moses did exactly what God intended for it to do. First of all, the law, according to Paul in Romans 3, Romans 7, it taught people, it gave people a knowledge of sin. That's what Paul said. He said the law, that's one thing that the law did. In one way he said, if it weren't for the law, I wouldn't have known what sin is. So to say that in a positive way, it's the law made me know what sin is. Also, by sort of describing sin or teaching about sin, it also impressed upon man's minds and hearts that they need salvation. Because we're in sin. Sin is bad. Sin is deadly, spiritually speaking. It separates from God. Therefore, we need a remedy. We need salvation. The law impressed on people that need for salvation. And according to what Paul told the Galatians, he said that the law served as our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian. Another one of those statements that suggests that the law of Moses is no more. It is no longer in effect in any sense of the term. Like Dean already mentioned, Jesus said, I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. I came not to destroy the law or the prophets. Again, there's there are specific connotations in the word destroy or abolish in the sense of canceling it prematurely. He didn't come to do that. But the New Testament explicitly does say that he did end it. So if he ended it, then that can't be what he meant when he said, I haven't come to destroy it. So those two things are not going to disagree with each other. And so when he said, I came to fulfill it, whether you destroy it or fulfill it, in either case, you've ended it. But what Jesus came to do is to fulfill it, not to destroy it. He lived by it perfectly, and he fulfilled it both in himself and in his, in I guess two senses you could say. He fulfilled it by keeping it, and he fulfilled it by being the one to whom it pointed. And so because he finished the work God gave him to do, we know he was successful. So despite many clear statements, some of which we've already alluded to, it is very clear that many people today, and apparently then, did not understand that Christians were no longer living under the law of Moses. It is my personal opinion that even today, that is one of the most fundamental roadblocks or stumbling blocks for many people who maybe sincerely want to follow the Bible and claim to believe in the Bible. They don't understand that there is a bold line between the old and the new covenants, to the extent that the old covenant is irrelevant as far as Christian life, daily living is concerned, as far as Christian worship is concerned, as far as Christian practice, I guess you could say, and doctrine is concerned. It's not that the Old Testament, let me distinguish between what I mean by between the Old Covenant and the Old Testament. Sometimes we use them the same way, but they're not exactly the same thing, because I would say the Old Testament is the record of the Old Covenant. So the Old Testament, what we're not saying, and this is, again, another misunderstanding that a lot of people have accused us and others maybe of not believing in the Old Testament. That's not true. I believe in the Old Testament every single bit as much as the New Testament. There is no distinction between its inspiration. There's no distinction between its truth. It is just as true and just as inspired and has been given by the same God that the New Testament was given by. What the distinction is that the Old Covenant has no bearing directly on the New Covenant. From our perspective. Now, of course, there is some bleed over, some carryover. God didn't change. So what God knew was right and said was right and wrong, as far as on a moral principle level, not in the specifics of the law of Moses, but just in the bigger moral arena, didn't really change. Adultery, sinful then, sinful now. Murder, sinful then, sinful now, and so on and so forth. Homosexuality, sinful then, which is a fornication. All forms of fornication, sinful then, sinful now. But the law of Moses was a covenant that was given specifically to one group of people. Yes? Yeah.
They don't understand that there is a distinction between the person and their sinful behavior.
Yes, that is true, and it's unfortunate. And the thing is,
I think with that and the proclivity in particular is because for so many people that is their identity, their whole identity, and so when you condemn that sin or temptation,
you're condemning everything about them.
even more as personal attacks.
Yeah, that is true. The problem is they equate and I mean people of the world in general, not just of a certain persuasion, but they equate a distance between, say, us and them as hate. That's the problem. It's not hate. It's that, in other words, to them, the Christian thing to do would be to accept their lifestyle and pretend like they're no different than anybody else, including yourself. That's not what Jesus would say to do. So the sin, Jesus, Paul, other inspired writers instructed, we cannot have fellowship with the works of darkness. That's what one way Paul put it in Ephesians. He said to have no fellowship with such. But that is not a lack of love for the person. Yes, sir. Yeah. It's a totally different thing, yeah. And the reason they don't see love that way is because they don't see what is best that way. So when you say love is wanting what's best for them, that's where the brick wall comes, because those living in sin, those in the world, apparently cannot bring themselves to even consider that might be what is best for them. Because to them, what's best for them is what they want. What's best for me is what I want. And for you to tell me that what I want is bad is hateful and judgmental. That's just a totally made up standard of judgment. That if you say what I want is wrong, you're being judgmental and hateful. Well, it wouldn't take very many hypothetical examples to blow that reasoning to bits. If you say what I want to do is wrong, what if I want to kill people? The thing that makes me happy is murdering people in cold blood. And for you to tell me that that's wrong, see, it's silly. It makes no sense. Of course, if you use that, they would say, well, that's ridiculous because what I'm doing, there's no victim, it's not hurting anybody. Well, yeah, it is hurting yourself. It's hurting whoever you engage with. So I guess at the end, it all comes down to a fundamental understanding of what God has said is right and wrong. And those who belong to God, who follow Him, or even claim to follow Him, must operate strictly within that line. Because we don't have a right to come up with our own standard of right and wrong. Yes, sir?
Or let us say we trust His judgment because we acknowledge that He knows better than we do.
Exactly.
Everybody else does. The rest disagrees, but we don't say we know better. In fact, we say we know worse. We trust the one who knows better. But what you said earlier about distance, I think that was a beautiful thing, that distance is perceived as hate. And it's not hate, but still it is distance. And the difficult thing may be difficult, maybe it's so simple as only Christian things can be simple, but still
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, I would say. And I think too many times people misrepresent Jesus as a defense mechanism and say, like you just said, they do it in from another motive of, well, didn't Jesus eat with sinners, and so on and so forth. First of all, I would say, okay, yes, he did eat with sinners, but at the same time, we have to remember that whenever we read about that, he was eating with people that they claimed to be sinners, that they viewed as sinners, his enemies. Now, sure, in many instances, they most likely, and in some other instances, were positively sinners. But I think sometimes people get the impression that that's all Jesus was ever going around doing. Was going around and eating with prostitutes, and he was always hanging out at the brothel, preaching to the prostitutes and things like that. And that's just not even close to true. But what Jesus saw in people, in that case, here's the Pharisees saying, why is he associating with these people? But it's not that those were the people that he was always associating with, but when there was an opportunity, a door, he wouldn't close the door on anybody. He would, if the door was there, he's going to go through it. Now, if they showed themselves, like the Pharisees so often did, to be closed-minded and closed-hearted and hard-hearted, he probably wouldn't bother again. But there's nobody that he, from the very outset, would say, this is a person or a kind of person that I will not preach the gospel to. He would preach to anybody. And even when he was eating with them, the eating with them wasn't an end unto itself. He had a deeper motive. Everything was always an avenue to getting the truth to them. So that's part of that delicate balance is, what is our motive? Are we just using Jesus eating with sinners as an excuse to not differentiate between anybody? Or are we doing what Jesus was actually doing, which is trying to either find or create doors of opportunity for the gospel? Big difference. Anybody have any? Yeah. 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 There's a lot of things we're missing, aren't there? If the old law is still in effect. One thing that some scholars have done and some people have done to try to justify their lack of understanding between the Old and New Covenant is divide the Old Covenant into a ceremonial and a spiritual part. So, because they know that the New Testament explicitly says that the Old was done away with. So, what it must mean then is that he did away with the ceremonial part, but he didn't do away with the other part. That is just a clever excuse that was devised simply, in my opinion, so that I can justify holding on to parts of the Old Covenant I want to, and meanwhile, and all the while I can explain away why I don't do a lot of the other things, like David mentioned, offering animal sacrifices, for instance. Well, if I'm going to use the old law for this thing, then why am I ignoring this thing? Well, it's because the one element is still always continued. The other element, I would argue there's no such distinction. And even if there was, some of the Old Testament prophets explicitly said that the reason that the Old Covenant was going to be brought to an end is because the Israelites did not keep it. And you know what? If there was any part of the old law that they did keep, it was the ceremonial part. So by their reasoning, if God was going to do away with the part that they didn't keep, then he would have done away with the spiritual part. Yeah, he didn't come to destroy it, to, like I'd characterize it as sort of canceling it prematurely.
Seemed like it made
He saw it to its end, yeah.
kind of made it more concrete, really, because it was still applies to. Yeah, it must
Yeah.
be moral.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, more, that's the word I was thinking of. The ceremonial and the moral.
The church there at Corinth was made up of a lot of different classes of people and that. And we know that when Paul was listing the sins that they committed, they had all obeyed the gospel. He was estimating the Christians there. He was listing them, and we know that alcoholics and all that was mentioned there, the smart leaders, and they did all obey the gospel, and they were forgiven. But then, they went right back to where they was. And that was what was the condemning part of it. They had obeyed the gospel, and they had their sins forgiven. But, just like the dog that returned to the vomit and the sow all in the mouth, they went right back to like the way they were doing. And so, I mean, individuals like that, they can obey the gospel, but yet they have to, what one preacher used to say, quit sinning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just it. They maybe stop for a little bit, just like a lot of people today, when they obey the gospel, they quit for a little bit, then all of a sudden they go right back to where they was.
Yeah.
That was what was happening there at Corinth. They had, changed, but then they went right back.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and don't get me wrong, Paul does make a distinction in the terms of the letter and the spirit of the law, but we shouldn't be too hasty to run away with that and just automatically assume that that is the equivalent of this man-made distinction of the ceremonial and moral aspect of the law, because it's a little bit more complicated that, and certainly doesn't fit exactly as men characterize it today. But let's notice in our text here, there are some more references that Paul made to, maybe not as plain and obvious and explicit as some of those other ones, like Colossians 2:14 and others, but he still references how the old covenant was being brought to an end. It was going to be brought to an end. And by the way, Jeremiah prophesied that it was going to, that God prophesied through Jeremiah 31 through 34, that he was going to make a new covenant that is not according to the covenant he made before. And there can't be two for the same people at the same time. But anyway, here's what he says. Notice the references. I've tried to highlight them to make them stand out a little bit more. But his language is a little bit more obscure, but if we read it and pay attention, it's not that difficult to see the contrast he's making and what he's referring to. He says, "Now if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory?" Notice, and by the way, this is the way that in verse 6 he mentions the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Well, yeah, there you go. See? The ceremonial part of the law kills, but the moral part gives life, and so it continued on. But he immediately uses that same language to refer to the letters as being the old law, and the Spirit, the ministry of the Spirit being the new. So he says, look at what he calls it first, the ministry of death. Okay, so he calls the old covenant, just picture a little two columns in your head. You got the old law and the new law. The new old covenant, new covenant. Here's some things he calls the old covenant. The ministry of death. He calls the new covenant, in contrast, the ministry of the Spirit. What does he say about each? He says the ministry of death did come with glory, It was glorious in a way, wasn't it? At least in the literal sense, that Moses' face had a glory about it. The word glory seems to mean some sort of radiance, shining in general. The glory of the Lord, just that would be more of a spiritual, I guess, emphasis of glory. The glory of the Lord, he's radiant in not just in a physical sense, but if at all, but in a spiritual sense, in a just overall sense, he is radiant and glorious. Well, Moses' face was actually shining, it seems, in some way. But he says, if it was the case that the ministry of death had a glory of its own, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit have? Well, what could that be referring to, if not the old covenant, which he's clearly referring to, because it was the one that was carved in letters on stone. It was the one that resulted in Moses' face. He's talking about in the Exodus record. Okay, so we got ministry of death, ministry of the Spirit. Ministry of death also, he says, was being brought to an end. Verse 9, he says, for if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, okay, got ministry of death, now we got ministry of condemnation, and we got being brought to an end. If there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. So here again, ministry of death coming to an end, ministry of condemnation, ministry of the Spirit, ministry of righteousness. More glory. Verse 10, indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. He's clearly drawing this contrast and distinction that the new is better than the old. The old had glory, but it pales in comparison to the glory of the new. But just the descriptive phrases that he uses of the old covenant, death, condemnation, it's being brought to an end. He says it once had glory and now has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. If you get one light that seems bright, if you get a light that is, many, many, many times brighter, it makes that light almost disappear. Like, you ever take your phone, you're looking at your phone in the house, and then you walk outside on a sunny day, and all of a sudden what used to be, blinding, now you can't even see it. It looks like a black screen because the sun is so outshines that your phone has to make it go to the brightest setting, and then even then, sometimes you can't see it. So the old had glory, but the new basically drowned it in its glory, and now it has come to have no glory at all. So he goes on then and says, for if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory. So they just keep coming. Ministry of death, ministry of condemnation is coming to an end. Used to have glory, now has no glory at all, being brought to an end again. And then we got ministry of the Spirit, ministry of righteousness, far exceeds it in glory, surpasses it in glory, and it's permanent. So even just those last two, old, being brought to an end, new, permanent. It's replacing it, and it's going to be permanent.
And in the same sense, it's also much better.
And much better. And that's why it's going to be permanent. That's why it's taking its place. That's why it's permanent. Because it's not only better, it's perfect. It's the only thing that can accomplish what needs to be accomplished, which in this case is eternal life. Remission of sin. Not just a temporary forgiveness, but removal from as far as one end of the earth is from the other. That's how far God will remove our sins, like throwing it in the middle of the ocean. Okay, but he goes on to say that there are some whose minds were hardened. Christians have hope, verse 12, and we can be very bold because of the relationship we have with God through Christ and under the new covenant. And notice again in verse 13, he says, he refers to the old as what was being brought to an end. So he repeatedly refers to the old covenant as something that was being brought to an end, and something that was always being brought to an end. He says, but their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. He says, first he says that those back in that day, their minds were hardened, but he immediately moves in and says, even to this day, when the old covenant, who's they, you think? Who could they possibly be in a context like this? The Jews. They're the ones that read Moses in the way that they do. They're the ones who are the descendants of those who saw Moses' shining face. And okay, so when he says when they read the old covenant to this day, now if he didn't say to this day, then it would sound like he's still talking about the ones back then. But he says to this day, when those people that are alive, this generation of those people, when they read the old covenant, there's a veil. Yeah, and even to this day, it's still true. And not just of the Jews, but of many Christians. That's the irony. For many people who profess to be Christians, they've got a veil over their hearts when they read the Old Covenant and Moses. It lies over their hearts. Whether it's in the sense of not understanding it or not understanding that it is not discerning that line of completion where the new covenant has taken its place completely, or just not maybe for the Jews, the veil would, I guess, probably primarily be referring to the fact that they are rejecting Christ and they don't see Christ in it. But once you turn to Christ and once you accept Christ as the fulfillment, according to Paul, who would know, by the way, everything makes sense. Yes, sir.
I'm not questioning the translation, but I'm saying that in the distinction that you made earlier between Old Covenant and Old Testament, that would be when they read the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
Which speaks of, I don't say that the translation is wrong. I'm just
Yeah,
saying
I see, yeah.
One were to distinguish, they should be in the Testament.
Yeah, I would say so. Not just the old covenant in the sense of Leviticus and the, do this and don't do that, but any part of the Old Testament, there's a veil. So they don't see, they see the Messianic prophecies, they just don't see Christ as the Messiah. So Isaiah 53, for instance. You're not going to find a Jew or a true Jew, because I don't know how they could still be a Jew if they interpreted Isaiah 53 as a messianic prophecy of Christ. You're not going to find one who understands that Isaiah 53 is talking about Jesus. They're either going to say it refers to the Messiah that still hasn't come, or it's a national prophecy. It's referring to the nation. The suffering servant of Jehovah is the nation of Israel over time. See, that's because there's a veil. Now, I would say, now that we're running out of time or are out of time, that even to this day, in I guess the more direct and literal sense, when for the Jews, when a Jew turns to Jesus, the veil is lifted. In other words, just like with Paul, he spent the first few years of Christianity against it, and that fundamentally was Jesus Christ is a fraud. He deserved to die, and anybody that follows him deserves to be punished or die. But then, so during that time, Jesus, or Paul, he didn't see Jesus of Nazareth in any of the prophecies of the Old Testament. But then he did. When it was revealed to him, when Jesus appeared to him, and then when the further, I guess, knowledge and revelation was given to him, as he talked about in Galatians 2, just like with the other apostles, it all sort of clicked into place. Oh, it's Jesus. And this over here, Jesus. And this over here, Jesus. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So in that sense, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. But in another sense, for people today, when one truly turns to the Lord, and is sincerely trying to understand what the will of the Lord is, the same thing will result. The veil's lifted. I'm not trying to hold on to the baggage that I may have had before, just like Paul didn't. I'm not trying to hold on to some element of the Old Testament or the Old Covenant that I sort of like musical instruments, for instance, or any other thing. You know, I mean, you name it. Maybe there is somebody out there who really likes the idea of killing goats and bulls and rams and such. And maybe they do that. I highly doubt it, but maybe they do. I mean, besides Jews, of course. But just for the sake of argument, let's say they do. And they've come to believe in Jesus, but they're not really turning to him in the sense of understanding the implications of what they're doing, first of all. Because every time you offer an animal, you know what you're saying? The blood of Jesus ain't enough. And then, also, you're holding on to a relic of the old covenant that has been done away with. So, when they actually turn to the Lord, the veil will be removed. When you open your heart to the truth, and you actually want the truth, you can find it. And I firmly believe that about anybody. Anybody can find the truth and can come to the truth. When one turns to the Lord, the veil's removed. But it's so significant, it's so intriguing that when Paul says to this day, it's still true. That's the tragic thing. Here we are, we're 2,000 years later, almost. And what Paul says was going on in that day, 2 Corinthians 3:14 and 15, still hasn't been resolved. There are still people who have a veil over their hearts in some way, and even in the exact sense that he talked about with the law of Moses, or with the Old Covenant, or the Old Testament. The new is not only better than the old, but it was intended by God and designed by God to take its place. And the Hebrews writer talks about that too. You can't have two at the same time. And along those lines is this, and I added a little bit to this application. We no longer live under the law of Moses. However, nor is it true, nor is anyone still rightly living under it. There's no such thing as living under the law of Moses and being right with God in the 21st century, or the 2nd century for that matter. There's no such thing. It was done away. To live under the law of Moses is a fundamental rejection of Jesus Christ. And you cannot be right with God the Father, who sent Jesus Christ to die for you, if you still live under the law of Moses. So, as Paul said, I used to be a Jew, and I was right with God. But then there was a time in my life, and I'm paraphrasing and sort of summarizing, there used to be a time in my life when I was a Jew and I wasn't right with God anymore. But I wanted to still be right with God. So you know what I had to do? I had to stop being a Jew. And I became a Christian. And put away that old baggage and that old law, because under Christ we have a new law, the law of Christ. And Paul does call it the law of Christ at least twice in the New Testament. So much for all that. We're not under law anymore. We're under grace. No, we are under law. We're just not under the law of Moses. We're under the law of Christ.